sustainable rangeland management and all what's behind and with it in Eastern African countries. We have a lot of references to Kenya and Uganda, but of course it's relevant, as we saw also in the first speech, in many other countries. And there was a note that there's an echo. I don't know whether I have a problem, so I better don't talk a lot. I would like, maybe our forum colleagues can remind again what's best for the handling in the chat, in the question and answers, and how to do it with raising the hand. And then I'm really happy that we can hear another talk of Professor Oliver Basonga. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angelica. We request participants to raise their hands once they have any issue they want to raise with the presenter. The facilitator will often maybe ask you to raise your hands, but in case the facilitator has not asked you to raise the hand and you have a burning question, you can post it under the Q&A, which is the icon in your screen for questions and answers. So once the facilitator is ready, can respond directly by answering it by talking, or can just write the answer in that Q&A. For comments, you can post under the chat. Usually, it is difficult to follow some of the questions in the chat if there are many, but if it is under Q&A, it is easier to see. But feel free to post your questions under Q&A, and then any comments you can raise under the chat. So you're most welcome to this training. Thank you.
Just a moment. David, are you able to help with the quiz? Because at one point I'll be able to ask you to put it up.
Yes, the quiz is online. So when you are ready, it will be launched. Any of our colleagues around can launch.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Prof.
So I think it is another day, and today we want to proceed with the module training, and to go somewhere. Okay. And today's topic is basically on some of the theoretical underpinnings and models that govern rangeland ecosystem dynamics. These are the models and the concepts that have been applied to inform the type of decisions, the type of interventions that occur in the rangelands. I would say they've been used to inform, but also at the same time misinform some of the decisions, because we've seen where they have not also been appropriately applied. So they're very, very important because they form the basis of a lot of decisions, be it in practice or policy. So this is very, very important after understanding the context, what rangelands are, where they are, what they are used for, and getting to delve deeper to understand the key biophysical or ecological characteristics of the rangeland ecosystems. The next thing is basically to understand some of these theories and concepts that are being used to inform decision in the rangelands. And so this session will basically take us through the historical perspectives of these models as used to describe or understand the rangeland ecological dynamics, the principles behind them, a bit of the critique of the various models, and their applications and challenges. And we expect that by the end of this lesson, all of us should be able to understand these theoretical concepts and models and how they are applied in rangeland management. So a bit on the historical perspectives and what you are seeing in terms of evolution informed by the discourse, research, and debates about these models basically shows how complex. It shows our appreciation of the complexity in the rangeland ecosystems. In the early 20th century, the most dominant concept was that of the succession theory. Then between 1990 and 1970s came in the rangeland condition and trend concept and the equilibrium paradigm. We are going to look at all this, so you don't have to worry. And this basically were informed by the Clementian succession theory. We're going to go through all this so that you get to understand what they mean. Between 1980s and 1990s, there was emergence of non-equilibrium thinking to counter the equilibrium paradigm. And between 1990s to 2000s, there's been dominance of the state and transition models away from the dichotomy of either equilibrium or non-equilibrium, kind of thinking. And therefore, currently, given that pathway, currently, this emphasis on basically integration or synthesis of these different models or approaches to better understand the rangeland dynamics and to ensure more of close to accurate uh, uh, decisions with respect to rangeland management. So let's start with the Clementian succession theory. This is something that I'm sure most of you who have studied biology at various levels and at lower level may have encountered succession uh, theory. And this theory assumes that, plant communities progress from one state to another in a more rather predictable linear kind of progression or pathway after disturbance towards a presumed climax, a steady state, what they also call the potential natural state. This is a presumed pristine state, the desired state, judged by the type of plants in the community and also the status of other ecological aspects like the soil. So the climax community represent, in this case, a stable endpoint that after the disturbance, the vegetation community will progress towards some sort of a desired state, which is steady as determined by climate and soil. And this laid the foundation for the range condition model. It set the basis for monitoring rangeland health, the state of the rangeland. Based on this, one would then judge whether rangeland is in poor state, is in fair state, is in good state. So, something is bothering me on the screen. Let me just don't know whether I can deal with it. Anyway, I think I can live with it. So the range condition and the range model, what then came to be referred to as the range model, has been the yardstick. And most people out there will talk about this when we refer to rangeland health. It's been the procedure for evaluating vegetation dynamics in the rangelands. And it emphasizes particularly grazing as the primary driver of the ecological dynamics in the rangelands. And the basis of it is the succession theory. So you can see the connection. It also envisions vegetation change as a continuous one and a reversible one that follows some linear single axis from upon disturbance or from degraded states to a climax community, as I've already indicated. Okay? So in this model, we classify vegetation based on vegetation or plant community based on its position to the already presumed climax community. Yeah, ending up with whether the rangeland condition is either excellent, good, fair, or poor. Okay? And this is in relation to that presumed climax. And as I did say, this climax is presumed to have certain species which are key for the purpose we are monitoring rangeland for. And this forms the basis of rangeland condition assessment. It utilizes the increaser and decreaser species as indicators. And the increaser species are, these species are originally present in the rangelands. They are desired species. And so as the use pressure increases, then they're expected to decline because they are selected and they're desired by the grazers. That's the decreasers, sorry. And then the increasers are those species that are either originally present in the range or invade the rangelands following heavy use or with increase in use pressure. And these are the ones referred to as either increasers or invaders. So they become more common as grazing pressure increases in the rangelands. So these are basically now used as the indicators to determine the state or the health of the rangelands under this model. So just to demonstrate the process of primary succession, the primary succession is expected to occur both in plant community, but also in the development of the soil itself. So it's presumed that it starts at a state of bare rock. There's no soil. And then there is the weathering of the rock to form the soil. You end up with a poor soil. Then you have the pioneer plant species coming in to colonize. Yeah, this progresses to another stage of plant communities that are more superior to the pioneer stage. As the soil also develops, they add organic matter to the soil, and the soil also improves in fertility and structure. So you end up with a more complex plant community towards that presumed climax. But at the same time, the soil also progresses in terms of development from a young to a relatively mature soil, which has or can support even more complex vegetation or plant community. So ideally, this is how primary succession works. What about secondary succession? This one does not require soil. So it starts when the existing plant community is disturbed by certain drivers. Okay? So already there's a plant community in place, so there is soil. Sorry if I say the opposite. There's soil, and so the succession starts from there after the disturbance of the existing plant community and progresses into a more complex community along the succession line. So you have the simple pioneer plants die after disturbance, and then the process of succession would see the soil layer develop further, soil layer thickens, then you have more superior plant forms coming in. They may not be superior in any other form, but they are most suited for the kind of the current ecological conditions. And then you have more and more complex vegetation coming in. So you move from the pioneer plants community to a state of grasses and forbs, and even to a more complex state that encompasses trees and shrubs. And at this stage, the animals also are attracted because of the prevailing conditions, and you have even a more complex community at that level. So it basically starts with the establishment of the plant communities, and there's competition, and only those which are successful and have the competitive advantage survive. Yeah. In the process, there is site modification. Organic matter is added to the soil. The soil also changes in its complexity, availability of moisture and nutrients. And at this level also, the condition also certainly would favor certain species more than the others. So what you finally end up with at a level where now we can say the plant community is stabilized are the ones which are most competitive. Okay? So this process goes through what we call the serial stages. And these are distinct community type through the succession sequence as you get to what one would call potential natural community. So, some of the important concepts in succession. One is ecological site, because at the end of the day, one would ask, where exactly do we assess these changes? And so we use ecological sites at reference points. And these are quite distinct kind of land or sites which are homogeneous in terms of vegetation, the climate, and the soil. And they respond to management practices or interventions in the same way. So the characteristics of an ecological site is the products of all those environmental factors that would influence both the soil and vegetation, including the disturbance that also interact with this. Then there is community resilience. And this is the ability of a plant community to go back to the prior compositional structure after a disturbance is removed. And this disturbance can be in many forms. It could be fire, it could be drought, it could be grazing, or whatever it is. And there is community resistance. And this is the plant community's ability to avoid being changed following a particular disturbance. Okay? So a bit of a critique of the succession theory and range model. Here we assume a more linear, a more mechanistic kind of progression of a plant community from one state to another. We assume reversibility, but this rarely applies in highly unpredictable environments in the arid and semi-arid lands. These models also neglects the impact of stochastic, the random events that do occur, and the interaction with other disturbances like fire and drought. And this can cause abrupt vegetation changes. And so if we talk more of a uniform linear kind of pathway that is predictable, then this can hardly happen in unpredictable and highly heterogeneous kind of systems as we experience in the rangelands. The models also emphasize grazing as the sole driver of vegetation change, whereas we know this is not the case. Because then if we only focus on grazing as the only source of change, then we ignore all other noises, all other disturbances, all other factors that trigger change. So it's oversimplification of the situation, especially in our rangelands. So this continuous and reversible, view of vegetation dynamics also fails to capture the possibility that we can have multiple stable states from one state to another. For a particular site, you can have more than one stable state, plant community stable states, okay? With possible transition from one state to another when certain thresholds are crossed. Oh, sorry, something there. So, David, is it possible to give that quiz now for a break? Or is it
Yes,
coming too soon? I just
It is
realized that I
okay.
included it in the slide.
It is okay, Prof. We can
Yes.
launch it.
Yeah, can you launch it?
Yes, it is launched.
So there is a quiz up there. And I want the participants who have been listening to give answers to this. What type of succession could be either primary or secondary that would be triggered by fire to reduce the invasive acacia reficients in the rangelands? What would this event of intervention lead to in terms of succession? What type of succession is likely to follow this kind of action? What type of succession is likely to be triggered by an erosion event that removes the soil and leaves bedrock on rangelands? And what type of succession would be triggered by overgrazing livestock on the bushed grasslands? So can we have answers streaming in, and then we can move to the next stage? The polls are coming in. We only have 100% for the second question. David, you'll monitor this from your end, and then we can alert me, then we...
Prof, you should be able to see already the update that in question 1, you have 83% saying it is a secondary.
Yes, I can see that, and the polls are still going on.
Okay.
So
you will let us know when we can stop it, because it has been running for around 3 minutes now.
okay, 1 more minute and then we close the poll. So
Okay.
kindly add your answers. Okay, so I can see for question 1, majority are saying that when you introduce fire to reduce the invasive species, then this is likely to trigger a secondary succession.
Prof, can we end it now? And then you can
Yeah,
read the results.
just end it, so long as I will still be able to see it and go through.
Yes, we have shared it with all of them, so should be able to see, even it giving the correct answers.
Okay. So the correct answer there for question 1 is secondary succession. So majority of you are right. For question 2, an erosion event that removes all the soil and leaves the bedrock on the rangelands can only trigger primary succession, because then it starts from a bare rock. Primary succession. So you are also right. Majority of you are right on that. Type 3, overgrazing by livestock on the bushed grassland would trigger secondary succession. So again, majority of you are right there. And the last question, on the restoration practice involving removal of vegetation and range reseeding with perennial grasses, is likely to trigger secondary succession as well. Thank you. So we can proceed now. So at one point, I will have to play some video for you to just break the monotony. But let's, maybe I can do it straight away. Let me do it straight away, just a minute. I have them in a separate file to avoid confusion. So I will play this video just to summarize rangeland succession. Should be playing. I guess it should.
So now that you guys have a good idea of rangeland improvements and what those can look like, I want to talk a little bit about rangeland succession. So succession really comes in two major forms, either
Just a moment. Just a moment. Okay, sorry for the interruption.
So now that you guys have a good idea of rangeland improvements and what those can look like, I want to talk a little bit about rangeland succession. So succession really comes in two major forms, either primary succession or secondary succession. But from a general concept, succession on rangeland is where the orderly change of plants actually occurs over time. So with succession principles, you'll actually see a gradual replacement of one plant community by another plant community, and that's going to be through a natural process over time. So it's very different than invasive species. So invasive species is an outside force actually changing the plant community. Succession would be part of a natural process. The first type of succession is primary, and primary succession is really where you start with parent material or rock or bedrock. And so this, for rangelands in the US, as well as for most part of the world, primary succession was a thousands of year process where we created soil from bedrock. However, there are some areas such as South America, parts of Mexico, Hawaii, that are dealing with primary succession currently, as we're starting to see new rock formations through volcanic activity form, and the weather patterns actually having to start creating sediment from those existing rock formations. The second type of succession is secondary, and this is the one that we deal with most as rangeland managers. And this is where the soil is already in place. You've just had some other sort of event take place that has wiped out a lot of the vegetation. So let's talk first about primary succession. And the bottom line here is that the soils as well as the plants are going to evolve together. So this is a figure out of your book from Dr. Gay in 1965. And he was one of the first ones to coin this primary succession term. And he defined it as the plant stage, which we can actually see over here to the left, and the soil development stages really evolve together. So where we have parent material from a soil standpoint down here during primaries, or the first part of primary succession, as more sediment is broken down and creating more topsoil, we'll see a poorer soil being developed, then a fertile soil, and then a very highly fertile soil. And so with the plants development, they're going to evolve with the soil. As you can see, the type of plants and organisms that are going to be attached to bedrock is going to be lichens, algae, and mosses. And those are going to help break down the rock material. And then with poor soil, we're going to start seeing early maturing annual forbs and a few annual grasses. And then we'll move into perennial grasses and a few shrubs. And finally, during the highly fertile soil in the climax stage, you'll see a dense stand of tall, deep-rooted plants, and which can also be trees as well. So with primary succession, that's where we really see plants and plants and soil evolving together.
Yes, Vivian.
So this is going to begin without any soil in place. So again,
did you raise your hand?
Landslides, places where flooding has taken place and completely wiped out or taken out
Yes, Prof. I was requesting to kindly put the video in PowerPoint mode so that it's bigger. Hello? Prof. I was requesting for the video to be put in PowerPoint mode, that slide, so that we could see. I hope I'm heard.
Yes, you were heard, but I think the problem is on the connection side at the moment. Oliver, now you are muted. We are not really sure whether sound and video are now broke down now.
No, I think I'm trying to ask him to unmute. His network is not stable. Prof, please unmute. Yes, go ahead. You might have to turn off the video because I think your net connection is.
I think so. It's really messing me up. So let me turn off the video and see if it works for me now. Oh no, I think. Sorry about that again. Let me see if it works. Let's hope it works now. Oh.
You guys have a good
So we were somewhere over there.
form already in place. You just had some other sort of event, and he defined it as the material from a soil standpoint down here during primaries, plants and organisms that are going to be attached to bedrock is going to be lichens, algae, and mosses. And finally, during the highly fertile soil in the climax stage, you'll see a dense stand of tall, deep-rooted plants, and which can also be trees as well. So with primary succession, that's where we really see plants and plants and soil evolving together. So this is going to begin without any soil in place. So again, sites of volcanoes, landslides, places where flooding has taken place and completely wiped out or taken out all of the soil. And the first step is where the living organisms like lichens and mosses and algae are going to attach to the rock and start the breakdown process. And those are going to be involved at this stage because they really don't need soil to survive. So those species that attach to the bedrock we call pioneer species. And from there, the soil is going to then start to form as lichens, and other forces such as weather and wind and erosion are going to help to break down the rocks into smaller pieces and start forming soil. And the lichens are really, really important during this stage because as they die, they're going to go through a decomposition phase, and they're going to start to add smaller amounts of organic matter to the rock to make soil. So this is an example of primary succession taking place and where we have lots of lichens around this particular area. And this is all happening on bedrock. So that area in the center, we actually are starting to see some sort of vegetation take place, but there's not really a whole lot of dense soil there. It's a lot of organic matter from the lichens that have died and gone through their life cycle. The second type of succession, again, is what we deal with more often as range managers, and this is secondary. And secondary succession is going to begin in a place where soil has already been established. So secondary succession occurs at a much quicker pace than primary succession. And we see secondary succession events happening after forest fires, after floods, after major weather events, earthquakes, as well as other major natural forces. So the basic idea of succession is that first, the plants that are going to establish as the first life form in succession, or whether primary or secondary, are very, very simple. So a lot of our annuals. And these are going to go through a life cycle of a year, and they're going to go through their life cycle and die very quickly, and they're going to add to the organic matter. As the soil layer thickens and grass begins to grow, we're going to start seeing more wildflowers, as well as other plants that are going to start to grow. So again, more annuals, more herbaceous species. These plants are going to continue to die, ending their life cycle and contribute more nutrients back to the soil. After we get through several years of this process, then you actually have enough topsoil made from organic matter and breaking down of the bedrock that shrubs and trees can then begin to survive. So, and at this point, we start to see small insects, small birds, and mammals begin to inhabit the area. So at this point, what was once now bare rock actually has the potential to support a variety of life. And so we try to manage the forces that cause these type of changes. So just as an example of secondary succession, we're going to start up here with juniper woodlands. So this woodland area is a natural state. So this would be what we call a climax state. And if we have some sort of catastrophic event happen, such as fire, it's going to leave us with a skeleton forest. So we're going to have bare soil, we're going to have lots of dead trees. So the process of returning to that climax state is very process driven. So we're first going to see annual grasses that are going to come back first. The annual grasses are going to be followed by perennial grasses and a forb shrub stage. And then we're going to see perennial grasses and forbs and young junipers come back in this juniper woodland. So those juniper trees are going to be very small. And then eventually, with lots of time, the junipers and the shrubs are going to be taking over the landscape to return eventually to the climax population of the juniper woodland.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's end it there so that we continue. And that was basically to complement what I've basically taken you through. And now we can proceed. And next, we're going to talk about some of the two dominant paradigms in rangeland ecological dynamics. And these two concepts are the equilibrium and non-equilibrium rangeland concepts. And this debate came mostly to the fore from African or tropical rangeland studies. Whereas the equilibrium paradigm is density dependent in the sense that it emphasizes the dominance of biotic factors in driving the process of rangeland dynamics or determining the rangeland condition for that matter. The non-equilibrium paradigm emphasizes the importance of a biotic or climate in the dynamics that we observe in the rangelands. You will realize that we are basically making reference to vegetation dynamics in this case, because this is the most single important indicator of rangeland health. So, although we have these two paradigms which have dominated the debate for quite some time, they may apply or may be appropriate for different environments, and you're going to see that, how that unfolds. There is also recognition that both processes can operate simultaneously. And if that's the case, then why not integrate them to have more accurate understanding of the dynamics, more context-specific models to inform decisions? So, let's start by looking at the equilibrium paradigm or equilibrium systems in the rangelands. Okay? The equilibrium paradigm is also known as the balance of nature. And it has formed the old mainstream view on rangeland, dynamics. And it has three major assumptions. One of them is that there are strong internal controls within a plant community that maintains its stability through some sort of internal feedbacks that regulates community dynamics and eventually drives it towards that presumed climax stage. Okay? So the emphasis on internal control as opposed to external controls. That there are negative feedbacks, that population density dependent mechanisms. Yeah? For example, when you have decreased competition as grazing pressure rises, then that somehow counters or rather reverses the progression. So we're talking about negative feedback loop. The positive feedback loop drives the process in the same direction. When you have a negative feedback loop, it reverses the process. So it counteracts the disturbance and somewhat end up stabilizing composition and productivity in a plant community state. The third one is carrying capacity. That there's some sort of defined maximum number of grazers that a site can support, yeah, without destroying the range. So we assume that equilibrium system would return to their pre-disturbed state if you remove the disturbance, or they can return to their pre-disturbance trajectory or pathway or progression before that disturbance when you remove it. And what are the management implications? Based on this, managers will set their livestock numbers below that carrying capacity to prevent overuse or degradation, because the carrying capacity defines the maximum number that you can stock, yeah, without undermining the productivity of the range. So the stocking rate comes in as one of the management implications. So it is presumed that reducing the stocking below the carrying capacity will allow vegetation to recover. That's the assumption. But of course, we know there are also other factors other than just grazing. And we're going to see more on this when we get to an equilibrium paradigm that basically contest this kind of approach. So the vegetation composition and range condition trends are therefore continuously monitored in management to inform adaptive changes in the management. For you to be able to deal, to control the stocking rates, to monitor and make adjustment, it means that you have to continuously monitor the rangeland condition. Okay? And put in place management options to either keep the system as near as possible to the equilibrium state or enable recovery following disturbance. Now, what of the non-equilibrium paradigm in rangeland ecology? It is also called the flux of nature. And this is founded on the assumption that ecosystems possess a limited capacity for internal regulation, which we've seen is the basis for the equilibrium paradigm. And this is because rangeland ecosystems are quite highly unpredictable. And the external factors or forcings dominate. Okay? It emphasizes the event-driven vegetation dynamics. You know, those stochastic events that can cause abrupt change, irreversible changes are quite key here. Because the rangeland ecosystems are more complex than one would imagine as depicted in the equilibrium model. So, the stochastic abiotic events, of which is basically about the dominance of the precipitation as a driver. Okay? These are mainly external and they are unpredictable in nature. That's why they can end up causing very abrupt changes which are not expected, then nullifying the linearity that is assumed in the Clementian succession theory. There's unpredictability of rainfall and the dominant drivers of rangeland vegetation and livestock, which are the dominant drivers of rangeland vegetation and livestock dynamics. In this paradigm or in this concept, there are weak biotic feedbacks and decoupling because rainfall-driven fluctuations in plant growth often outpace the capacity of livestock population to respond. So they are kind of decoupled. They are not, you don't get the link because, for example, if you were to remove grazing following the rains, one would ask if that would make a difference. So the biotic feedbacks then become weak and they are decoupled. So the attributes of these two systems are based on varying degrees of internal regulation on the equilibrium system side and conversely on the external disturbances on the non-equilibrium system side. So comparing the abiotic patterns and equilibrium systems, these are relatively constant, while in non-equilibrium systems, they are stochastic and variable, highly variable. The plant-herbivore interactions in equilibrium systems are tightly coupled, while there's weak or no coupling when you consider a non-equilibrium state. And that means that under equilibrium system, there's biotic regulation as opposed to abiotic drivers that dominate in non-equilibrium systems. When it comes to population patterns, under equilibrium system, as I've indicated, these are density-independent driven models. And in non-equilibrium system are density-independent models. Okay? So as opposed to in equilibrium systems, in non-equilibrium systems, the dynamic carrying capacity limits the population tracking. So it doesn't entirely, there is no direct relationship between the population and the dynamics of the vegetation dynamics. In community, when it comes to community and ecosystem characteristics, under equilibrium systems, these are competitive structuring of communities. Well, this element of competition is not expressed in non-equilibrium systems. And this alludes to the same basis of internal regulation and equilibrium systems as opposed to external regulation in non-equilibrium systems. So this is more of contrasting the two systems. So why do we need to integrate these two systems? As I've said, the two systems may operate in the same locality at different scales and at different times. And so it's no longer a dichotomy of whether it is equilibrium or non-equilibrium systems, because they may occur in a continuum also. So rangeland systems rarely fit exclusively into equilibrium or non-equilibrium categories, because both dynamics often operate together within the same landscape at different scale or context. The equilibrium-like processes where the dynamics, vegetation dynamics, are directly attributed to grazing, for example, will prevail in more stable, more mesic, more wetter areas, more productive patches, as opposed to the drier ones, where the non-equilibrium dynamics would be evident. But also the variability in distribution of resources also defies the assumption of homogeneity in equilibrium models. And I've talked about this of highly unpredictable and variable states that doesn't make it easy to conclude that kind of stability in rangeland ecosystems. The landscape mosaics would arise where both equilibrium and non-equilibrium processes may be present at different patches, as I've said. So in space, but also in time, you may have different systems operating, both equilibrium and non-equilibrium. And this is the reason why it's good to embrace both of them than having a direct dichotomy between the two. Now, some bit of the synthesis is that the current paradigm is that the rangeland ecosystems exhibit more of a continuum from equilibrium to non-equilibrium, and not the two as mutually exclusive. So the debate has shifted from that dichotomy to integrating systems. So the state and transition model then provides this platform that allows multiple stable conditions or quasi-stable states, which can transition to different states when certain thresholds are reached. And these are quite context specific, because this will vary from one state to the other. It will vary from the driver that triggers that transition from one state to another. It will vary depending on the interaction of these drivers with other factors. So there are a number of factors that would push a community planned state to move from one state to another. So recognizing the continuum helps to target management strategies. So we can use the equilibrium tools like stocking rate, where we have more or less strong and predictable feedbacks. And in a more simple, in quotes, systems. But we can also emphasize a more adaptive, opportunistic responses or mobility under non-equilibrium states. So the complexity requires adaptive, opportunistic strategies. And then we can monitor for thresholds. And this requires data to be able to monitor thresholds. So you know at what point are we likely to move from one state to the next? And what are the likely drivers? What are the likely factors that can push one state to the next one? So defining all these requires some data. This brings us to the state and transition models. And this, as I did indicate at the beginning, emerged in the 80s, and mainly to respond to the shortcomings of the earlier models. Okay? There's some chats share link to article Susan Beta. Okay. Thanks, Christian. I'm seeing some. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So these models assume that rangelands can exhibit multiple states. And this has been widely accepted and probably the truth. It contests the range model and equilibrium paradigm that postulates a continuous and reversible vegetation change that is predictable towards some sort of climax. Because the evidence has shown that rangelands experience some abrupt, nonlinear, and sometimes irreversible changes. Yeah, and this is what makes it different from the earlier models. So the state and transition models enable operationalization of management in systems where assumptions of the equilibrium paradigm cannot apply, especially with respect to our highly variable arid and semi-arid rangelands. It describes vegetation dynamics by identifying stable plants, community states, point at which they transition to a different stage, so state, okay? And that's the threshold. So this is very important in terms of putting in place interventions, either to arrest undesirable change or to improve the health of rangelands. Sorry. Okay. Some of core concepts that we'll always be encountering when talking about state and transition models. One of them are the stable states. We've mentioned these stable states so many times, so I thought it's important to just look at them before we proceed. What are stable states? They are very distinct, self-reinforcing vegetation communities, and this could be grasslands, shrublands, woodlands, that persist under consistent sets of drivers and feedbacks. Yeah, so these states are created by the existing conditions in terms of soil, in terms of drivers, and the interaction between different drivers. And the product is the stable states of a plant community. So a single site may support more than one stable state. And this depends on the disturbance history and management. Then you have the transitions. These are often abrupt and nonlinear shift from one stable state of a plant community to another. And they are normally triggered when ecological thresholds are breached. Yeah? And breaching such stable threshold for stable states to move from one state to another normally happens when fire is excluded, for example, when there is chronic overgrazing, or there are some, extreme climatic events that abruptly change things. And this will shift a stable state or plant community from one state to another. And the drivers and the factors that trigger this are exclusion of fire as a management tool, or overgrazing or climatic events. Ecological thresholds. These are points where small changes in drivers result in often big or large and sometimes irreversible changes in the ecosystem and state. Okay? So these thresholds are very important to monitor. Yeah? Because they will give you the warning whether you are likely to move from, example, a desired stable state to undesired one. And then one can make a decision to intervene. So once these thresholds are crossed, returning to the previous state may require substantial interventions. So it may require more than just removing the driver. You may now want to invest substantial financial resources, personnel, for example, in controlling the bush, in soil restoration, and so on. So very significant interventions are required once a threshold is crossed. So the work of a rangeland manager is to monitor these thresholds so that it is cheaper and easier, less costly, and time saving to deal with the potential shifts before the thresholds are breached. So I want you to imagine a ball and cap analogy of state and transition model. Assume that you have a ball resting in a cup. Okay? The ball is here resting in a cup. And the shape of the cup is the system stability. The shape of this cup is the system stability. It will determine how stable the cup is in there. Deeper cups would mean more stable and resilient states. If it is shallow, then it means that with just a little effort, you can push the cup off that, the ball of the cup. But if it's deep, it will require substantial effort to remove or to move the ball from the deep cup to another state. So transitions and thresholds are quite key because if closely monitored, timely interventions can be put in place. Okay? So, if the ball is in this cup here, you can see you need some force, you need some effort to push it over the threshold to move to another state. And this will depend on the magnitude of the driver or the trigger, okay, to move it to that. But it will also depend on the interaction with other factors. So it requires a lot of consideration with respect to data to be able to clearly define this threshold, to know when we are likely to tip over. So a disturbance, could be grazing, drought, or fire, can push the ball up the side of the cup. But as to whether this is possible or not will depend on the magnitude of the disturbance and other factors as I've mentioned. If the disturbance is large enough to push the ball over the rim, that it means it will pass the threshold, it falls into a new cup, and that will be the alternative state. And in here, it will have its own stability and other properties. I'm talking about the plant community. So reversing the ball, the state, would require very substantial effort and time, and this may not be possible in the short run. So this analogy is basically meant to let you understand the state, the transition as determined by the set or the threshold. Okay. So what are the drivers of the state transitions? The key ones are the ones that you already mentioned: fire, grazing, and drought. And fire has been regularly used to prevent bush or woody encroachment and to maintain grass-dominated states. So it often leads to a threshold being crossed when you suppress or exclude fire. So you can end up with bush encroachment when you exclude such kind of an important determinant. And reversing the state to the original one would be difficult and may require substantial resources. Grazing. The grazing pressure would, for example, drive grasslands to shrublands-dominated states. From perennial to annual plant dominance is when you increase the pressure of grazing. Drought. Prolonged droughts may induce plant mortality. In the process, reduce perennial cover and set the stage of encroachment by shrubs or opportunistic species. But the impact of drought is often magnified when they coincide with high intensity of grazing. And so this is why I've been talking about also the interactions. You can't avoid that in the rangelands because you look at many factors working in concert to push certain plant community state to another level. So the state and transition models integrate a quite integrative approach that bridge the two concepts into a unified conceptual framework. because it allows for multiple drivers of change and also emphasize their interactions. It allows discontinuous threshold-driven and sometimes irreversible transitions from one state to another, e.g. from grasslands to shrublands, which is consistent with the non-equilibrium perspectives. So it captures both the within state dynamics and between state dynamics of trunk. So within state dynamics, the vegetation change may be relatively continuous and reversible, like in the equilibrium systems. But between state dynamics, here the transition can occur abruptly and often crossing the ecological thresholds, resulting in a persistent alternative state, as we've seen exemplified in previous slide. So when certain thresholds are crossed, usually by a combination of management and stochastic events that are inherent in the variable rangelands, the system would shift from a new state to a new state. And as I've said, this would not be readily reversed by simply removing the initial driver. For example, in cases of overgrazing, if you simply think that you'll reverse the process by just excluding the animals, it may not work because maybe the threshold has been breached, the soils have been damaged, and so it may also require taking care of the soils to be able to get back to the original state. So this model exemplifies the shift from a rigid paradigm debate to more flexible and context-dependent approach, which suits our variable rangeland ecosystems, and is now widely used to inform rangeland restoration planning, because it helps the managers to identify different states, plant community states, monitor their transitions and thresholds to be able to decide which context-specific interventions can be put in place to avoid moving from desired to undesirable states. So, how does this work in rangeland monitoring? Because then one then has to monitor the health of the range. How do you apply these models in monitoring the rangeland resources to inform decisions? So we have the state-specific indicators and transition-sensitive indicators which are needed to monitor state and transition in rangeland condition. So the state-specific indicators requires identification of indicators that clearly differentiate among distinct vegetation states. Like you can have dominant species, ground cover, functional groups, composition, soil health, and soil health parameters. So, but what you need to keep in mind is that the indicators have to be sensitive enough to the drivers to be able to detect the slightest change as a result of these drivers. They should also be sensitive to the feedbacks to be able to detect any change. The transition-sensitive indicators are required because they provide the signal of the signal of the imminent transitions to give early warning that an ecological threshold may be approaching. So this is very important because then you need to arrest such kind of undesirable changes before they occur. So the choice of the type of indicators to use to monitor also have to be very specific to the transition pathways that you have interest in. Am I seeing some charts? These are more, yeah.
I'm just
Thank
sharing
you.
literature, Oliver.
Yes, yeah, thank you. These are very good literature. So kindly look at the chart and capture those. I think a number of them I also already have. Yeah, just capture them so that you don't lose for further reading. Thank you, Christian. But we need long-term data sets to be able to monitor rangelands well. We need a lot of data set to be able to apply these models as well. Probably that's been one of the biggest weaknesses, that we are not able to develop context location-specific models because of lack of long-term data. So we end up applying some models developed elsewhere that may not suit the specific environments or landscapes where we have interest. And because these dynamics occur over years, you require long-term data because the short-term monitoring may miss some gradual trends, abrupt transitions, and also may miss out on the legacy effects of the past disturbances. So you need a very long-term data set. Such kind of data provide context for interpreting variability and distinguishing between these episodic fluctuations. And when managers have such kind of extended records, they are able to effectively put in place interventions, detect unintended consequences, and put in place adaptive management mechanisms before thresholds are crossed. So in short, what are we saying? We are saying that state and transition models require multi-year data sets to inform states, verify transition triggers, and estimate probabilities of transition. Without data, it's not possible to accurately use these models to inform decision. So, the practical aspect, how do we identify restoration thresholds? This again require long-term monitoring. To be able to identify thresholds require very long-term monitoring to understand local drivers and feedbacks. So the drivers and feedbacks are quite key. Okay? What happens when you intervene? What happens when you remove a driver? So these feedbacks, as I did say, can be both negative and positive. You can remove a driver and it still perpetuates the process in the same direction or reverse the process. So understanding the local drivers and feedbacks are quite key in determining restoration thresholds. So ecological indicators include the persistent absence of key perennial species. Managers will tell you disappearance or decline of some key forage species. Widespread bare ground, soil crusting, and so on. So thresholds may be identified by tracking failed recovery. If you remove the driver, okay, and you don't see any positive change, then there is a big question mark. You should look at the shift in plant soil feedbacks. effects in soil and hydrology that persist even after management change. If something persists and desirable state persists after removing the driver, then there must be a problem. It basically means that a threshold must have been breached. The approaches for reversing undesirable transitions. There are various approaches. One would be rehabilitation and active restoration. Okay, with desired rangeland species. You can also amend or rehabilitate the soils by applying amendment, depending where the problem is, breaking the crust to allow regeneration. Yeah. Reintroduction of fire to control bush encroachment. One can use patch burning or rotational fire to create spatial and successional diversity. So you just don't do it without a strategy. You may want to recreate that kind of patchiness. So, what are some of the limitations and challenges in application of the state and transition model? The quantification of states and transition. The approach is largely qualitative, and there's very little to help quantify or conduct quantitative determinations. And this is normally due to lack of substantial data to be able to enable this. Okay? For example, when you're establishing cover, and this normally one would want to focus on the dominant species or functional groups. But the clear numerical thresholds for transitions in terms of looking at the specific percentage of grass cover and density can also be hard to establish. And if this is not possible, then you risk being subjective in your interpretation of the results. Data on transition, lack of empirical data, means that you cannot clearly quantify transition with respect to probability of the rates, probability that you're likely to transit or cross the threshold from one state to another. So again, on data scale and generalization issues, which is quite common, you need this data to detect rare transition and threshold effects. But data can also be costly and often unavailable. There's the scale sensitivity. Models that are based on very fine data, very localized data, miss out on broader landscape processes. But also, models developed on a very coarse and at a large scale also miss the details, the nitty-gritties at local level. So that's a challenge. Spatial and temporal heterogeneity, the highly variable ecosystem, variation and disturbance regimes, quite complex, making it very difficult to separate the real state changes from short-term fluctuations. Model generalization and transferability. So you have very the context dependency, in the sense that these features, the states and transition and threshold, could be highly site-specific. And of course, that's what they're meant to be. They are highly site-specific. And this limits their transferability to other areas or other sites. Management application gap. You may have the models, but the application, if they are too complex or if they are oversimplified, could be a challenge. Sometimes it is more of the data, lack of data, and also expertise on the side of the land managers or rangeland managers, the stewards, to be able to apply this. Other challenge is the integration with other tools. Although this is being attempted, neither here nor there, but it becomes a big challenge integrating these state and transition models with other tools that are coming up, digital tools, other technologies like the GIS and stuff, to be able to inform decisions better is still a challenge, because it also requires a cross-disciplinary kind of, approach to it. And then I have a couple of links and references there. I will stop sharing so that I can see you, and I will welcome questions, comments, some nice discussions around what what I've presented today. I would prefer we have that instead of me playing for you another video, which is also very interesting, but I will give it, I will provide it so that you can watch it at your own time. But now it's time to ask questions, and I hope you didn't go to slumber. So the floor is open. Yes, Angelica. I can't hear you.
You are muted.
Unmute.
Okay, I'm sorry. You mentioned the carrying capacity, which also changes the rangeland composition and what's happening afterwards. And yesterday we also had something about the ecology. So is there some, like, yeah, a combination of the ecological monitoring and the decision making on grazing and how much is grazed and when to stop the overgrazing?
Yeah, the concept, thank you, Angelica. The concept of carrying capacity is also another very controversial one. Because these are concepts that are largely developed in the Western rangelands, and we may not also directly apply them the way they are without modifications. But yes, carrying capacity has been used as the basis, yeah, of adjusting or controlling stocking rates, in the sense that it is believed that there is a maximum number of animals that the rangeland can hold or support without undermining the productivity. And so is one of the basis of decision making with respect to how many numbers or how you're going to manage your grazing, so that you always keep that carrying capacity at either somewhere there or below, so that you don't trip or tip or cross the threshold. But I'm saying it is interesting because a number of us are also contesting the application of carrying capacity in the pastoral systems, especially where mobility is meant to increase that carrying capacity. How does mobility increase carrying capacity? It means that you can keep more than what you can ideally not keep under confined or paddocked kind of system. Because when you move and keep animals in one place for the shortest time possible and move to another place and keep up rotating and only coming back to where you started after some time when the vegetation has regenerated, that means that you can actually keep more than one would prescribe if you had a fence paddock, for example. So these are very complex issues, and that's why I say some of them have been misused or used to guide decision. I think Christian really want to talk about this.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for pointing out the discussion, the controversy. Carrying capacity initially is a term that was developed in the marine shipping industry to determine how many containers can be put into one ship. So that is where the term carrying capacity came from, and it was by analogy then adapted to how many animals can be put on one rangeland. Now, as Oliver has very nicely explained, the animals are doing something on the rangeland, they are doing something to the vegetation, and the vegetation is responding to the animal action. And I can manage my livestock in such a way that their grazing stimulates more plant growth. However, I cannot manage my containers that I put into the ship so that the ship becomes bigger. So I'm a very strong contester of the carrying capacity thing, because it suggests that that is a given characteristics of a rangeland. And it leaves less room for the possibility that that rangeland may change. I would therefore rather advise everybody to operate with stocking rates and stocking densities and grazing intensity. And there's lots of literature about that, because that rather refers to what people do and how many animals they put on the rangeland. And leaves me with the freedom that the rangeland may change under animal impact. So that, thanks, Oliver.
Thank you.
Yes, Angelica. Yeah, these are the kind of serious debates that you have when it comes to rangeland ecology. A lot of controversies arising. And of course, these models have evolved a lot, but the mainstream views still persist to date. They still persist to date, and to a larger extent determine what happens in our rangelands. So as much as science has really progressed, the discourse has progressed a lot, recognition of such that there are the rangeland ecosystem are so complex that you can't simply oversimplify them in that manner. The management policy decisions still rely to a large extent on the old mainstream view about the dynamics of rangeland ecosystems.
But Oliver, just coming back to the other part of Angelica's question, how do we then decide how many animals to put? And of course, yes, you must closely in the spot where you are and in the spot where you intend to go with your animals, either as an individual or as a community, monitor your rangeland vegetation, not only how much is there, but also in which growing stage. And you must know something about the effect that the animal induces in the vegetation, so that you then can assess where to go, with how many animals, how dense to graze, and how long to stay. And yes, you need constant monitoring. And as you mentioned, the pastoralists or the ranchers, they do that. No? Pastoralists send out scouts. Ranchers go check their paddocks, and they decide based on what they see there, how many animals, for how long, which velocity they graze there. So yes, you need to monitor. But there's questions in the question and answer.
Okay. Let me see. When you talk about drivers of state changes, you mentioned fire. Does this apply to both wild and those instituted by humans? Please clarify for me. Yes. Whether natural or prescribed, the impacts would be the same. But again, as I did say, I think I made this comment yesterday, that fire has got both negative and positive impacts on the environment. Yeah. So it will also depend on the timing of the fire, the frequency, the intensity. Yeah. This will determine whether fire can push a steady plant community from one state to another, crossing the threshold. So yes, these apply for both wild and prescribed. When it is prescribed, then you know what I mean here. Because then I did say these models are used to inform or identify the states, the transitions, and thresholds. So at one point, after studying or monitoring this over a period of time, then one can decide, can we prescribe fire? Okay? To move the community, plant community, from one state to another, a desired state. So that is if it is prescribed. But if it's wild one, then it can go either way. It can either benefit, move you from a desired to an undesired state, or the other way around. Did I answer you, Andrew? Andrew? Can you hear me?
Let me unmute Andrew maybe
Oh, okay, okay.
to allow him to talk. Andrew, you can unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. You have answered me.
Okay. So, do you have any other comment? Any other question? Or if you've not understood anything, or if you've understood everything, let me know.
Please, if anyone would like to talk or ask questions, just raise your hand so that we can enable you to talk.
Please.
Thank you.
Maybe, Oliver, you have brought a lot of examples, always from the US, from Karen Launchbow and others from the University of Idaho. What would be other examples? Is there any fundamental work on the rangeland dynamics in the different parts of Africa? And could you give hints on further reading for that? Or should we?
Yes, yes. There are a lot of readings, especially from Southern Africa. A lot of rangeland ecological work has happened in the Eastern or the Horn of Africa much earlier, but we still have bits here and there, but a lot of quite interesting ones with respect to this topic, actually from the South. You can see even the type of literature you've shared there. A lot of them are from Southern Africa. So yes, we can provide more examples so that one can see that these are also applicable in our African rangeland. And that's also the bias that we still also stuck a little bit with what happens in other areas. We probably should do better on that, provide even more localized, and this depends on the availability of these research outputs for various topics. Yes, Christian. So, if we are fine, Angelica, I want to hand over back to you.
Yeah. As you were asking for feedback, I can point out 2 comments in the chat, thanking you for the great and nice lecture. And I would say also a really understandable one to see what the concepts are and why they might be careful to apply. So thank you very much. I would say this was good to listen or to have the chance to listen to this explanation. And yeah, we are coming to an end. So if nobody has something urgent to question, then we will continue tomorrow. I'm looking if there's some urgent hand. And we will have then the final of our kick-off week with the rangelands as socio-ecological systems. So as we've heard already during the last days, it's complex, it's variable, and we have to look more into these interlinkages, and now the socio-ecological interlinkages will be a part of tomorrow's speech. I have an inside question to Esther, Vivian, Semi, and Halima. If you have any questions about what to do tomorrow, let us know via email or clarify it here. I think you are really free to organize or prepare some questions which might cover today, but tomorrow, but also the linkages to the earlier days. So thank you. I'm joining the thank yous in the chat. There are several ones, and seeing you all tomorrow.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.